morning, I'm Bob McCaw. After practicing law for about 40 years, I turned to writing fiction. Let me tell you a little bit about how that happened. While I was practicing, I went to an ABA convention in Honolulu and spent some time on the Big Island, became fascinated. Ultimately bought a house there and spent 20 years living off and on the Big Island. And I found it enormously interesting to study Hawaiian history, to learn how the Polynesians had crossed 2,000 miles of hostile ocean to find the Big Island, how they had developed a society there, how they developed a beautifully spoken language but had no written language, how they built a community and became an internationally recognized country for over 100 years before the U.S. appropriated the islands and they became a territory of the U.S. And I became fascinated with that whole history and I wanted to share it. I decided to share it through a novel, and I had to pick a genre. Well, I'd always been interested in puzzles. In my legal career, I had done a lot of detective work, a lot of investigation, and I decided to make my protagonist a detective, i.e. the chief detective in the Hilo Police Department. But I made this character an unusual one because he has a criminal past, which is unusual for a detective. As a teenager, he got into a fight with a man who had harassed him, ultimately arranged the death of his father and killed the man. But rather than fess up, he covered the murder up as a suicide and got away with it. And so with that background as a cop, he has a particularly thorough and skeptical view of crime scenes and therefore thinks a little bit like a perpetrator. So how have I developed that character? Well, I spent a lot of time in every place on the Big Island where the story is told: Volcanoes National Park, Hilo itself, along the Hamakua coast. I talked to Hawaiians, I talked to police officers, I made friends out there, I learned a little bit of the Hawaiian language, and I built all of those into a series of 5 books, the latest one of which comes out next year. It'll be called Retribution. But in that course of doing that, I also pulled on threads of my own history. I've always been interested in astronomy. So the first book takes you to the Alice telescopes atop Mauna Kea, which is a pseudonym for the Keck telescopes. Part of the book and many of the scenes take place on the top of Mauna Kea, 14,000 feet up in the air, a place that was glaciated during the ice ages and still suffers from extraordinary winter storms. Very few people know that there's skiing on Mauna Kea. It's a little different than the Hawaiian beach and palm tree settings that most people think of. But anyway, that's sort of how I began to write these books. And as I went along, I used a variety of techniques. I made up characters from people that I met. I would take the way they speak from one character, and I would take the physical description from another, a little bit of the history from one. I have a whole set of characters in the books. There's Nalani, who's his girlfriend. There's Zeke Brown, who's the prosecutor. I even have Hook Howe, a commercial fisherman who becomes a confidential informer. And I use my cell phone to take pictures of the scenes that I want to later describe, so I can remember all of the details. that go into making a credible book and an interesting picture of the islands that I came to love very much.